Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. A long time ago, and I mean a very long time ago, my friend Javi Koshi Matthew recommended some Indian literature to me. So I explored the books, I looked them up, and the one that caught my attention the most was The Story of a Goat, also known as Poonachi, by Perumal Murugan. Why is that? Well, for one, I am interested in stories that explore the perspective of animals, so that is one of the reasons. But then I also have to say that Indian literature is an area that I feel that I should explore a lot more in depth. So this provided a great opportunity for that, and I thank my friend for recommending this book because of that. So the story of a goat, as the title suggests or indicates, follows a goat named Poonachi. This is a she-goat. From the moment that she is given to an old man by this figure that is described as a giant. They also say that he has a resemblance to the demon Bakasuran. So this old man gets this goat from this giant or demon, and we see or hear about her life from that moment until the point of her death at the end of the novel. So what the old man does is he just accepts this gift and he takes the goat Poonachi back to his wife, and both of them raise this goat and face a series of difficulties that arise along the way. Poonachi experiences love, danger, sorrow, joy, worry, jealousy, anger, all of the emotions that you can possibly imagine, and she does so in a very quote unquote human way. There is also an element in the novel of social commentary that you're going to find because we hear about the prejudices of some of the characters, and also we hear about the regime. Okay, there is a regime, a government that is oppressive and that rules the lives of both people and animals. So that is definitely an important dimension of the text, and we are going to explore it a little bit in a few minutes. This is a very short novel, just so you know, you can tell right here. And Perumal Murugan says that he wrote it in 3 months, so it seems to have just flowed. You know, it seems it was one of those ideas that he had that just kind of took care of itself as a narrative. It is only 178 pages in length, and the story is divided into 24 chapters that are very brief. And let me tell you, the narrative is also very easy to follow because it's linear. Okay, this is just a good old-fashioned, straightforward tale. And for that reason, many people have called it a fable. Okay, a fable is a very specific subgenre or sub-subgenre. So because animals are important in the story, I can definitely see the reason for that, but people are also important in this tale. So for that reason, I would simply call it a folk tale. Okay, and a folk tale, of course, is kind of like an umbrella term. It's much more ample than calling it a fable. So I'm going to say it's a folk tale, but also a modern folk tale. The style is direct, but very detailed in its realism, especially when it comes to describing life in a rural setting. And for that reason, it reminded me of the work of an author that I have recently reread and that I have also shared my ideas with you on, and that is Horacio Quiroga. Because Horacio Quiroga also has a style that is apparently simple, but that it is also poetic. And he also has great respect when it comes to describing nature and describing animals. But the amazing thing in the story of a goat, or Poonachi, is that as we continue to read, we get closer and closer to Poonachi, to the point where we can follow her thoughts, we can feel her emotions, and we can even hear her words. So it's a very interesting perspective that we have here. And speaking of that, speaking of the feelings of this protagonist, this animal that stands at the center of the story, the animals in Murugan's novel are incredibly complex. They are just as fascinating as human beings. For example, when you get to the midpoint of the novel, I always, look out for midpoints because they tend to be important. So at that point, Poonachi meets Puvan, and this is a male goat with whom she develops a mutual attraction. So there's a bond that is established between them, and she is never going to forget this goat. So that is something that you would expect from a human being. But other than that type of thing, that example that I have just given you, there's also the fact that in this novel, the animals seem to understand people a lot more than we might think. I think many of us, and I include myself here, those of us who come from a European culture, most of the time I believe that we do not give enough credit to animals because culturally we have been trained, if you will, or we have been taught to regard them as unthinking creatures. We are humans, we are the ones who think. Animals do not think. We have kind of like a black or white kind of mentality, many of us, or most of us, however you like, when it comes to that. So we think of them as unthinking creatures, we think of them as property. Okay, we think of them as resources, or maybe even directly as food. So we also have differences that we make depending on the species. So that's why you may have heard that idea of speciesism. How we consider some animals to be pets and some animals to be food. And that's why, when we find out, for example, that in a culture different from our own, an animal that we consider to be a pet is eaten, right? That comes as a shock to us. But that's a very different story. But that is one of the things that I thought about as I was reading this novel, and I think it's definitely one of the topics that the author put there, so as to, raise some important questions and to make us think about animals in a deeper way and in a more interesting way, I think. Now, as I told you, another important dimension of the novel, besides this idea of animals, has to do with the exploration of oppression, in this case, from this regime that is in power in the fictional world of the novel. This regime dictates what happens and what does not, what is proper and what is not. And there's a criticism of this that you're going to find throughout the novel. I just want to read you, for example, a little dialogue here. There are two characters speaking, and somebody says, "Speak softly, sir. The regime has ears on all sides." The other character says, "There's an old saying that the regime is deaf." And the first character comes back saying, "It's deaf only when we speak about our problems. When we talk about the regime, its ears are quite sharp." So you have that criticism of the regime being, completely oblivious to the needs of the people. When it comes to policing the people, then it's definitely paying attention. Children and animals must have, in this regime, their ears pierced. So notice how even a simple thing like that shows you how this regime sees people and animals as absolutely the same thing. They're on the same level. So even in those details, you have that social commentary, that criticism of society and of oppression. When Poonachi gives birth at one point to 7 kids, the government must be informed, because maybe they think that the old couple stole some of these kids. So the first thing they do is they decide, okay, let's go and tell the government that it happened right now. And when the old man with somebody else goes and tells the government that, the government questions him in a lot of detail. When did this happen? How did this happen? Where were you? How was it that the goat got pregnant? So there's this idea of, keeping people and animals both under surveillance. And if you go to page 122, there is also a little note here that I wanted to share with you. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. "These days, even if you fart, you have to register it with the government," a woman said. So you have also that idea that even the intimate details of people are kept under control. And another woman says, "We might even have a law which says you can only fart twice in a day." So you see what I'm saying when it comes to the criticism of oppression that goes on in this novel. And you have little points of that throughout the text. But here's an interesting thing that you're going to see, and this is it. Just as the regime controls the lives of people, those very same people that are oppressed control the lives of their animals. So what you have here is a chain or a vicious cycle of oppression, in other words, that the novel is exposing and also criticizing. My impressions on this novel, let me say I thoroughly enjoyed it. Okay, I thoroughly enjoyed the story of a goat. I found Poonachi herself to be endearing, and also I found myself caring about her and, just relating to her as a character, because her story is really quite moving. And I also found it refreshing to read a novel that follows not the fate of a human being, but the fate of an animal. It's kind of like a different perspective. It's a really nice change, and it's also enriching as a reading experience, because generally speaking, we don't get that. Even if we read fables, the animals in those fables are supposed to stand for a certain type of person, right? So there's always that pointing to a person. You definitely have a little bit of that in this novel, but it's more than that. It's a little bit more complex, and that's one of the many reasons why it really spoke to me. And what I loved was just how true to life Perumal Murugan's world, fictional world, is. Okay, this is just a story that stirs your heart with no cheap tricks. So that is another thing that I value these days. You know, when you get a good old story, right, that manages to reach you at an emotional level, also to make you think. So there are many levels going on here in this reading experience. Bottom line, I read that The Story of a Goat has been compared by many people to George Orwell's Animal Farm. And I can definitely see, you know, there's a little bit of George Orwell's novella in this novel by Perumal Murugan. And I was also reminded of a story like I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki. Okay, but The Story of a Goat is much more restrained than that and much more realistic. In I Am a Cat, you get directly the perspective of a cat who is the narrator of the novel, and it's also a very long novel. But I thought about that story as I was reading this novel. And just in case you don't know, I did a video on I Am a Cat. It's in fact one of my most popular videos. So I'm going to link it to the description of this video just in case you're interested in that. But let me tell you, the text that I thought about foremost, right, as I was reading and when I was researching the books to see which one I was going to choose, it was not a written text, but a film. And you may have guessed already which one I am thinking about. Maybe you even thought about it as I was talking about this story. I am talking about Robert Bresson's Au hasard Balthazar. This is the story of a donkey. It's one of the classics of French cinema and of world cinema. It is also a very moving story. So I invite you to watch it if you have not had the opportunity to do that already. But just as in that film, Murugan's novel really managed to awaken my sympathy and to, you know, really touch my heart in a very profound way. So that's why I made that connection right there. And I'm going to tell you, this is a book that I'm not going to forget anytime soon, because it really managed to reach me in a very interesting way, you know, unexpectedly, because I was not expecting to connect to a goat, you know, at an emotional level, the way that I did while I was reading this novel. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I'm always happy to hear them. Please also let me know if you have read this great novel and what your thoughts are about it. It's very easy to find in English, so, you know, I strongly recommend it to you. Those were my 2 cents on The Story of a Goat by Perumal Murugan. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.